Hi, everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. I want to welcome you to our latest Friends of the Everglades Live. We are going to be debriefing on the recently ended session of the Florida Legislature. I'm here with my colleague, Gil Smart. He wears two hats. He is both the Policy Director at Friends of the Everglades and also the Executive Director of Vote Water. He's here today in his capacity as Policy Director with us. Welcome, Gil.
Thank you. I'm suffering from PTSD, but thankfully the session is over. So
I was going to ask how you were holding up. It's always a little bit of shock and awe and PTSD after the legislative session ends. So we're going to dive into that. We're going to spend the next hour with you all. Thank you to everyone in our audience for joining. We've noticed that our audience has grown over the months as we've put more focus on our legislative accountability work. That's a huge credit to the Tierney and Wetzel Foundation, which provides us with a grant to do this kind of work. They really see the value, as do many of our Friends of the Everglades supporters, in translating the nitty-gritty, often very confusing action that goes down in Tallahassee, far away Tallahassee for most of us, into layman's terms and the impacts on our daily lives, both in Florida and our daily lives as we proceed, and also in our environment, the ecology of our environment. So we're going to break it down for you today and explain what happened during the 60-day session that ended on March 8th, what it means for you. We have a few wins this time, I'm pleased to say. We're going to talk about those, and also what you should be thinking about as we look ahead to the 2025 session, because we always have to be looking ahead. I want to add before we move on that if you are watching us on either YouTube or Facebook or Instagram or X, I guess we call it now, I still say Twitter, you can pose questions on those platforms and we will get to as many of them as possible at the end of our time here. Gil and I are going to give you a rundown for the next 40 minutes or so and then leave time for Q&A. Okay, so we can queue up our slides now and dig into the topic at hand, the 2024 session of the Florida Legislature. And if you advance one slide here, I'm going to just remind our audience about our legislative priorities at Friends of the Everglades. So we identified 7 honestly very ambitious priorities at the outset of session. We aim high, and I'm happy to report that we did have some success on a couple of these fronts. You'll see green check marks next to the priorities where we noticed success and made some progress. So let me just orient you to what we were focused on. Number 1, protecting wetlands. This is actually a national issue right now because the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling last year in the Sackett case that greatly diminishes wetlands protections under the Clean Water Act. So the onus is really falling to state and local governments to ensure that we're protecting wetlands to the fullest extent, since we don't have that federal backstop anymore. So that we put at the top of our priority list, and we did have some progress, mainly on defense. We helped kill a bad bill related to this that Gil is going to talk about in a bit. Our second priority was get serious about toxic algae. And for those of you who have been following the situation on Lake Okeechobee right now, you know that this is an imminent threat. We have a blue-green algae task force in the state of Florida that DeSantis appointed. Unfortunately, most of the recommendations of that task force have not been implemented. So we identified as our second priority to get serious about it, implement the solutions. We know the solutions. It relates to reining in polluters, and get that done. We didn't see as much progress as we would have liked on that front, and that's putting it nicely. Our third priority was to fix our failing BMAPs. BMAPs is one of the many jargony acronyms you'll hear in the environmental world in Tallahassee, and that stands for Basin Management Action Plans. These are basically roadmaps to control and address polluted waterways. Right now in Florida, they largely rely on a presumption of compliance on the part of polluting industries, agriculture, and others, and we have not fixed those. So that did not happen this session, but we're continuing to watch it. Number 4, this was another bright spot, the second bright spot. Don't ban fertilizer bans. We had this on our list because there was a concern that the state legislature was going to extend a moratorium. Gil will talk more about that in a minute. So that's another bright spot. And then 3 more priorities: smarter, controlled development, Florida at one time, starting in the mid 80s, was a real leader in terms of responsible growth management. Our government agencies were set up to vet development applications in a way that respected environmental needs. And that's been really diluted over the last several decades. So we want to bring back those days. And it's a high bar that we've set, but we're committed to it and we're going to keep it in the spotlight. And also, stopping sugarcane burning was a priority. We identified about 500,000 acres of sugarcane are burned south of Lake Okeechobee every year, and we want to put a stop to that. So we're going to keep that on our list until it happens. And finally, sending more clean water south. That needs to happen in order to stop the release of polluted water from Lake Okeechobee to the northern estuaries and to fully restore the Everglades. So those were our 7 priorities. Again, we're ambitious and we did make headway on a couple of them. And I just want to zoom in, if you'll advance to the next slide, to the Lake Okeechobee issue. So session started back in January, and in February, about halfway through, discharges started from Lake Okeechobee. And of course, our organization is very deeply committed to putting an end to harmful discharges from the lake to both the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee rivers and the Lake Worth Lagoon. So when this happened, we zoomed in. Meanwhile, an algae bloom has emerged on Lake Okeechobee. You can see in the image in the center that there's algae. This is just from a few days ago on the west side of the lake. So as these discharges continue into the spring and potentially the summer, algae could be transmitted east and west. How does this relate to the Florida legislature? Well, here's one way. The Florida legislature has declined to reappoint a representative to the governing board of the South Florida Water Management District from the Stewart area, which is deeply affected by these discharges. So Jackie Thurlow-Lippisch, way back last legislative session, was not reappointed to her seat on that governing board. That governing board seat is still vacant, and we really need someone who understands this Lake Okeechobee discharge issue and can be an advocate for an end to it to be appointed to the board. So legislature didn't address that this session either. We're still waiting for that seat to be filled. Governor DeSantis will make a new appointment at some point. We'll be watching for it. So just didn't want to dive too deep into the legislative session without acknowledging the harm that's happening right now as we sit today from Lake Okeechobee, and the state legislature certainly plays a role in this. So those were our priorities. That's what's going on now. Gil, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us a rundown of what you saw this session, and I hope your PTSD is waning a little bit.
You're triggering it again. All right, that's all right. So this was our this bill was probably this pair of bills was probably our number one priority. As Eve's talked about, the wetlands protections, which were sort of rescinded by the U.S. Supreme Court. A lot of states have stepped up to strengthen their own wetlands protections. Florida looked to be going in the opposite direction. These bills, House Bill 527 and Senate Bill 664, would have effectively gutted local wetlands protections by requiring any expanded buffer zones that counties or municipalities had established to be actually acquired by that government via eminent domain or purchase. It could have cost communities billions of dollars to acquire these lands that under ordinance now are being protected. As noted here, threatened to roll back or eliminate enhanced buffer zones around wetlands. And so this was kind of our public enemy number one. Fortunately, these bills did not go anywhere. They did not get any hearings. Sort of indicative, I guess, that the legislature did not take them very seriously, but that's always subject to change. This bill could come back again next year. A point here is that Representative Randy Maggard, who was the House sponsor of House Bill 527, last year also sponsored one of the worst, from our perspective, one of the worst bills out of the legislature, which thankfully did not pass. But that bill would have effectively preempted all local government attempts to control water regulation, anything to do with sort of water regs like wetlands protections, that sort of thing. So Maggard, these last 2 sessions, has sponsored legislation which we believe is really threatening to the integrity of Florida's wetlands, which are key to Florida's economy and environment. Obviously, the Everglades are wetlands. So we were happy to see that this bill went nowhere, and we have it as a water win.
We do. You can see our icon there, Waterwind for Friends of the Everglades. We want to thank everyone who paid attention when we raised a red flag on bills like this. It really made a difference. You'll see a few water wins throughout our discussion here, and that's a credit to everyone who's tuned in. We just could not achieve these defensive wins without you. Of course, we hope to score on offense, right? The irony is, we need more protective wetlands legislation in Florida, not less. So to see Representative Maggard coming back year after year, filing bills that would erode wetlands protections and also undermine home rule, right? It's one thing to sit in Tallahassee and make a decision, but to tell someone in Martin County or Lee County or Orange County that they can't have more protective wetlands measures in their local communities is really an affront, I think, to a lot of the will of Floridians. I mean, people know that the economy depends on clean water, our public health depends on clean water, and this is insulting, and fortunately it went nowhere. So thanks for checking that, Gil.
Absolutely. Okay. Moving on. This is a very interesting situation, these bills. It looked like these were going to pass, and then the House bill sponsored by Rep. Toby Overdorf did not. We and a lot of other organizations initially opposed this bill specifically because there was a provision in it that said that if you or I or a private citizen or an environmental organization challenged a decision by a water management district or by the Florida Department of Environmental Protections, if you challenged it and lost, you would be on the hook for the other side's legal fees. Very reminiscent of legislation that was passed last year and signed into law by Governor DeSantis that said if you challenged a comprehensive plan or comprehensive plan amendment and lost, you would have to pay the other side's legal fees. We see that it's called fee shifting for environmental challenges, and we see it as an attempt to intimidate citizens from filing these sorts of challenges in the first place. So that and another provision in this bill that would have required, quote, holistic reviews of the coastal permitting process, ostensibly to make it more efficient, but realistically meaning there would be less oversight. Those were the two initial provisions here that got us and a lot of other organizations sort of, alerted on this, and we opposed it. And ultimately, Senator Danny Burgess, sponsor of Senate Bill 738, and Overdorf, sponsor of Senate Bill or House Bill 789, stripped those two provisions out. But that left one other really problematic provision, which says if a polluter has a permit to release, water or, do discharges or whatever from a site, and you're harmed by it, you could not sue for personal injury or economic damage as a result of that permitted activity. Okay. That seemed like a direct giveaway to polluters. And again, we sort of mobilized against that aspect of the bill. And as noted here, hundreds of Friends supporters contacted their legislators on this, both initially when we came out against the first two provisions, and then subsequently when we came out against this third provision, putting a lot of pressure on these people. And ultimately, while Burgess's bill, Senate Bill 738, did pass the Senate, Overdorf's bill, House Bill 789, never got a vote on the floor of the House, and it failed. So it's a water win for sure. But as noted, we expect this bill to be reintroduced next year.
That's right. This one really came down to the wire, and we were waiting the final days of session to see if the House floor vote would occur. And again, I think it's a huge credit to the hundreds of folks who responded to Friends of the Everglades targeted action, and also the other conservation groups that spoke up on this. I do think it was a really good collective effort. Florida Springs Council was involved at the outset on the fee shifting and the holistic reviews. Captains for Clean Water got involved with that personal injury, economic damage provision, and we all worked effectively together. And we get questions sometimes about the prevailing party attorney's fees when we've fought these measures in the past, and even with this one, some folks say, well, doesn't this deter frivolous challenges or frivolous lawsuits? And there are already measures in law to address those kinds of things. This fee shifting really is designed to intimidate citizens. That said, we met with Representative Overdorf before session started, during session, and we wanted to know what the need was for that specific provision. And he cited frivolous permit challenges. And we said, well, please give us some examples of those. We asked him repeatedly. We never got those examples. So we'd love to see them if they're out there. But as far as we know, they don't exist. And it's frustrating to have legislators, like Representative Overdorf, who is an environmental consultant working for developers, advancing this kind of legislation when citizens at large don't want it. So thanks again, a water win. And like Gil said, we can expect this to come back in some form, and we'll be on high alert in 2025.
We'll be watching. Exactly. And this is another water win. And here we have to give some credit to the Sierra Club, which kind of led this charge. But a lot of organizations were involved, and we were heavily involved in this. So you may remember, if you watched our live stream end of session last year, and of course you did, that at the tail end of session in 2023, the legislature snuck through this provision in a budget bill that effectively banned new, what are called strong fertilizer ordinances, which means there's a summer blackout period. Makes sense, right? Because the summertime is when we get these huge downpours. You don't want to put fertilizer on your lawn, have it washed away that same day, into the storm sewers and into the water, your local waterways. So there's over 100 municipalities and something like 18 or 20 counties throughout Florida that have these strong fertilizer ordinances. The legislation that was snuck through last year prohibited any new such ordinances or strengthening existing ordinances while a study was done of the efficiency, the effectiveness of these sorts of bans. It was a short-term study. I think it was only $500,000 was allocated for it. It was released in December 2023. And as noted here, the study basically said, well, we need more longer term studies of this. But it also said that urban fertilizer ordinances like the ones we're talking about, they do no harm. They actually do help with nutrient reduction. They're not a silver bullet. They're not, quote unquote, the answer. I don't know that anybody ever said that they were. What we were expecting was an attempt to fund some longer term studies. And while those studies were going on, we fully expected there would be an attempt to extend the ban on new strong fertilizer ordinances for the duration of those studies, which could have been 5-6 years. So the entire conservation community, there is strength in numbers, as noted on the previous slide. The entire conservation community basically mobilized against this. A lot of local officials, county commissioners, city commissioners that have these sort of bans spoke up on behalf of them and said, look, these are helpful. We need to have these. This is a tool we have to have in our toolbox. Really, it was sort of an overwhelming show of opposition to any attempt to do this, and the sneak attack never materialized. So we like to think that, we and you, those of you who were involved in this, had a lot to do with that seeing the opposition to this, the folks who might have pushed this decided not to go that far. It's another water win for us this year.
Yeah, definitely. So that moratorium that was attached to the study last year will now expire in July, and local governments that want to enact strong fertilizer ordinances with blackout dates during the rainy season can now do that. So we were really concerned that there was going to be more funding for another study, which is what the first study recommended, and then the moratorium would be extended, and that didn't happen. We've said this before, but this is pretty much the least we can do for our waterways. These fertilizer ordinances are popular. You really don't need fertilizer on your lawn in the rainy season. In fact, my lawn doesn't have irrigation or fertilizer. It looks really bad right now, and I kind of hold that up as a badge of honor. I'm looking forward to the day when I can have no lawn and just rewild things. Kind of moving in that direction, if you ask my neighbors, probably. So anyhow, this is a win, and we're happy to report on it. Thanks for everyone who stood with us, and thanks to Sierra Club. They did a lot of heavy lifting. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. A number of other bad bills bit the dust, didn't go anywhere. House Bill 957, Senate Bill 1210, the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve. It would have revised the boundaries and shrunk it. That did not make it across the finish line. So goodbye. Again, this is one we may see again next year. This one generated a good bit of noise. House Bill 1641, Senate Bill 1126, regulation of auxiliary containers. Would have preempted regulation of all single-use containers like plastic water bottles, plastic bags, basically would have prohibited local communities from enacting their own prohibitions on these. These bills also failed. And then 1620, Senate Bill 1620 would have allowed FDP to surplus certain state-owned lands. That also went nowhere. So again, there was, we and other organizations did note our opposition to these bills. And they just didn't pass, which is good for you and me and Florida's environment. So.
Yeah. Yeah, quick note on the first one here, Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve. We joined with Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation and others in opposing the shrinking of these boundaries. And it was really ironic that this effort was happening as a new aquatic preserve was being proposed and actually was approved. We're going to get into that in a minute. So why create new preserves for underwater ecosystems if we're going to shrink them later? These boundaries, these designations have to mean something, and not just when it's convenient.
Right. Exactly. Sprawl bill. So you may recall that last year, last session, 2023, we termed that the session of sprawl. That title applied to this session as well. There were a whole bunch of what we call pro sprawl bills out there. Some passed, some didn't. A couple big ones failed, even though it looked like some of these had a good head of steam early on. The first one, House Bill 1221, Senate Bill 1184, would have actually changed the definition of urban sprawl to mean only unplanned or an uncontrolled development pattern. It also would have allowed infill development to be approved with administrative approval. In other words, they didn't have to have public hearings and allow the public to weigh in on those issues. That went down to defeat. The second one there, 1177, Senate Bill 1110, land development would have revised the procedures for local government review of changes to previously approved developments of regional impact. And there was a lot of cases where if you had a DRI that already had approval and you said, hey, we're going to do this instead of that, you didn't have to go through a public review process. Again, it could be approved administratively. There were a number of other provisions to this bill. Doesn't matter, the bill died. But a couple of them passed, a couple of them having to do with seeking to expedite residential building permits, because apparently we're not building homes fast enough here in Florida. We have to build them even more rapidly. At least that seems to be the attitude of the legislature. House Bill 267 sets really tight deadlines for local government that have to approve or deny building permit applications. If they don't provide written notification within 10 days, the permit is deemed approved. Senate Bill 812, expedited approval of residential building permits, requires governing body to let up to 50% of building permits be issued before a final plat is approved. And local governments must also establish a registry of 3 qualified contractors to assist with plan reviews. Because, see, you do stuff like this, you expedite building permits, make it easier and the whole process more efficient for the builders themselves, you're going to see a deluge of applications. Local government may not be able to handle that deluge, so we got to bring in some qualified contractors to help us review the plans. That seems to be exactly what's going to happen with legislation like this. It's going to pick up the pace of development here in Florida and all that entails.
Yeah, it's concerning. Guarding of the hen house may not be so effective there.
Exactly.
The urban sprawl definition, glad to see that one failed. That was an example of a really nebulous intent. Why would you want to revise the definition of urban sprawl? It really seemed driven by the development industry to make it more difficult to challenge sprawl. So glad to see that one failed for sure.
Yeah, make it, but you challenge the definition of sprawl so you can build more of it. And so then you can say that 4 strip malls in a row along an already crowded highway doesn't constitute sprawl. Well, I think most people would say that it does. If the law says it doesn't, you're good to rock and roll. So that's why people back that.
Yeah. And, it bears stating that Florida is one of the fastest growing states in the country. We were the fastest a couple years ago. And development absolutely contributes to our water quality issues. Sometimes it feels like there's a full-on assault on our last remaining green spaces in Florida, including low-lying flood-prone areas. So all these layers of regulations exist to safeguard against bad outcomes that could lead not just to environmental damage, but also flooding of neighboring properties, things of that nature. So mixed bag here, and glad we didn't see all of these pass.
Right, exactly. All right. Here's one that came close, as it has the last few years. It came close, and this was a good bill. This would have protected the Everglades protection area. House Bill 723, Senate Bill 1364 would have added a layer of protection requiring comprehensive plan and plan amendments for land within or near the Everglades protection area to follow a state-coordinated review process. And if there were determined to be impacts from a development proposal on the Everglades protection area, the state of Florida, the federal government has sunk billions of dollars into Everglades restoration. Why would we allow development projects which are going to impact this restoration. So the whole idea was we're going to add a layer of state oversight to this, and we're going to help mitigate these impacts. Great idea. Senate Bill 1364 actually passed the Senate. House Bill 723 never got past its second committee and died. And so this is at least the third year in a row this bill has made it oh so close, but did not pass the finish line.
The Everglades Protection Area, for folks who might not know, is a legally designated area designated in state law that includes the water conservation areas, north of Everglades National Park, includes Everglades National Park itself. So really vital area to protect and not allow development to encroach on. This proposal basically would require a state coordinated review process that is common sense, that really we should be doing kind of everywhere that's sensitive, but at the very least within a couple miles of the Everglades protection area. And we hope to see it back next year. We support it.
Absolutely. All right, here's a couple ones that passed. They're a bit of a mixed bag. House Bill 1557, Department of Environmental Protection. There was a bunch of provisions. This is sort of an omnibus bill. One thing we did like is it designated the Kristen Jacobs Aquatic Preserve. You can see on the map there, the dark blue is the area of the preserve. Coastal reef system. Really, that's great. It's enhanced protections for that system. That's wonderful. It's what we need to see more of. The bad side of this is there was a provision in here that allows for 30-year consumptive use water permits. Florida's planning horizon usually doesn't extend past 20 years. So how is it we're going to grant permits that are going to be good for 30 years when we don't know what the conditions are going to be 30 years down the road, and whether we can still allow that much water to be drawn out for consumptive use, that sort of thing? Will it still be safe to do so? It seems like a very irresponsible thing to do, but of course, thy name is the Florida legislature, so here you go. So that passed. Senate Bill 7040, ratification of DEP rules. So this updates the state's out-of-date stormwater regulations as required by the 2020 Clean Waterways Act. The rules were never going to be all that strict. Again, this has to do with stormwater as it affects municipalities, as it affects new development, that sort of thing. But the rules were significantly weakened during the legislative process by the development industry, the sprawl industry, as we call it. Numerous exemptions apply. For an example, you get the presumption of compliance. I hate that term, and we've talked about that before. Presumption of compliance, where compliance is demonstrated by modeling calculations versus actual data collection. In other words, you build a new development, and your computer modeling says that there's X amount of pollutants going to come off this development into the local waterways. And as long as you have a computer model showing that you're complying with the rules, you don't have to provide actual data. You are given the presumption of compliance. It's presumed that you are complying with the rules. No one's really going to check. Obviously, we have problems with that. So these new rules were touted in these committee stops as game changers. It was going to be huge protections for Florida's environment. There are others who've been tracking this rulemaking say it's not going to help, it might not help at all. And in fact, it could hurt because we've grandfathered so much into this. Basically almost any sort of development proposal that was submitted before the 1st of January this year is going to be grandfathered in. That's a bit of an overstatement, but not by much. So again, these were heavily, heavily watered down. And I think our position on this is it's better than nothing, but it's kind of close to not much. So.
Yeah, and the grandfathering in is a real concern. So this rulemaking stemmed from the Clean Waterways Act that was passed in 2021, right?
Yes.
And that, if you guys remember that bill, always be leery of bill names, because that Clean Waterways Act could result in some really damaging provisions like the grandfathering in that Gil just talked about. So we had our doubts about that one back in 2021, and it turns out they were founded. Incremental gains on the new stormwater regulations, but grandfathering in old properties is not going to help us.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I just want to mention, Gil, on the aquatic preserve. So the map you see on the right here, that blue highlighted area offshore is the Kristen Jacobs Aquatic Preserve. So that is a win. And I mentioned earlier that we didn't see any reason to shrink the boundaries of the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve. And it's great to see that we'll have some new protections on the East Coast here. So that's a good thing for sure. Also, I just had one thought. I can't help myself. On the presumption of compliance, I'm pretty sure my teenage son would like to have presumption of compliance in Algebra 2 class because it's, it's just, we all know it's not the way you get results, right? You've got to verify performance. We see this not just in the stormwater realm, but also in terms of agricultural polluters. I mentioned at the outset, basin management action plans over rely on presumption of compliance for landowners who are enrolled in best management practices. It just doesn't work unless you measure results.
Right. Exactly. All right. Budget issues. All right. Everglades related funding wound up totaling more than $700 million. That includes $614 million for SERP projects, another $71 million for NEP, the Northern Everglades and Estuaries Protection Programs, another $50 million for, quote, the design, engineering, construction of the specific project components designed to achieve the greatest reductions in harmful discharges to the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie estuaries. This is part of LOPE, the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project, which itself is part of SERP. There was some other bits and pieces in terms of funding in there as well, but it all totals over north of $700 million. Again, most of this is going to go towards what is termed sort of pumps and pipes, sort of massive engineering projects designed to help, quote unquote, solve our problems with the Everglades. Stay tuned, I guess, to see if they actually do. Florida Forever's the program was funded at $100 million. That's well below historic norms. I think Eve can talk maybe a little bit more about that. But advocates for saving, acquiring sensitive Florida lands were hopeful it's going to be higher. It was not. I know the folks who are involved in springs restorations effort, our friends of the Florida Springs Councilors, were very disappointed. The springs got $55 million. It was actually $5 million more than initially proposed. But it ain't much at all for the problems they're facing up there. And this is an interesting one. $4 million for IFAS, the Institute for Food and Agricultural Research at University of Florida, to study and update BMPs. BMPs are best management practices, and these are the methods that agriculture producers use to determine, for example, how much fertilizer to apply or other sort of things that pertain to water quality and runoff from farms and that sort of thing. IFAS makes recommendations on how the BMPs ought to be formulated, what they ought to say, and they're in the process of updating these best management practices. Now, a problem with the best management practices is they are formulated not to protect water quality, but to maximize agricultural yield. That's the purpose. Okay, and it's at cross purposes, really, in a lot of ways, with improving water quality. And so we're concerned that the new rules are going to be less stringent than the old rules. That, in fact, we may see an attempt to increase the amount of fertilizer that agricultural producers can use. Agricultural runoff is a huge factor in Florida's impaired waterways around the state. In some basins like Lake Okeechobee, it is far and away the biggest factor. And if we get into a situation where, the official recommendations in terms of fertilizer application and other things that are going to contribute to this, if we get into a situation where the official recommendations basically says, yeah, go to it, use more, we're going to have a lot of problems. So this is something we're watching really, really closely.
Yeah, another example of a study being funded perhaps for devious means with a preordained outcome in mind. So we don't like to see this. We'll be watching for the results of the study and pushing back against any watering down, so to speak, of these BMPs. Right. And on the Everglades related funding front, I'll just say a little bit more there. These are big numbers, right? More than $700 million. And our general philosophy at Friends of the Everglades is, yes, we need to keep Everglades funding flowing, but, and there's a big but, we also have to make sure that this money is flowing to effective projects that truly restore the Everglades, work with Mother Nature, not against it. So Gil mentioned LORP, which is within this funding. That's the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project, not plan. Mm-hmm. And that includes some ASR wells, aquifer storage and recovery wells, which we have, they are the subject of really deep scientific uncertainty, which we've gone on the record about to the Army Corps of Engineers. So, pipes and reservoirs, heavy infrastructure to restore the Everglades. Some of that is necessary, yes, because we've lost so much water storage over the years.
Mhm.
But what we build has to not have unintended consequences that are worse for the environment than the conditions we're living with. And that's just kind of our general rule of thumb at Friends of the Everglades. You also mentioned Florida Forever, Gil. $100 million, good. But by way of a reminder, back when Jeb Bush was governor, we were seeing levels at about 300 million a year. So we'd like to see that very popular land buying program back up to that level. And of course, our friends at the Springs Council definitely deserve more. They have their challenges, just like we do in the Everglades, and they shouldn't get short shrift.
Absolutely. Okay. All right, so here's an interesting one, and actually Eve and I have been talking about this kind of nonstop for the last 24 hours, trying to figure out exactly what's going on here. So it looks to be that there are going to be 2 studies funded next year in the budget that are going to pertain to, at least one of them is explicitly going to pertain to Lake Okeechobee. The other one probably is. And the question is, what are we looking to get out of these studies? So you see here, the first item talks about how in the budget, it specifically says that the South Florida Water Management District is going to enter into a contract with the water school at Florida Gulf Coast University for a $2 million study of the health and ecosystem of Lake Okeechobee. The study, quote, must take into account the health of plants, fish, and wildlife to be used for future planning of invasive plant control, replanting of native vegetation, and fish and game management. Okay, that's pretty broad. Report has to be delivered to Governor Ron DeSantis and legislative leaders by January 1st of next year. Then in the meantime, there's another $25 million, that's earmarked for FGCU's water school for a broader study of impaired waters. Now, an interesting aspect of this is this was funded in part after a request by Senate leaders. It was on what's called the sprinkle list. Apparently, legislative leaders are able to sort of sprinkle some of their preferred projects into the state budget. And when this was sprinkled into the state budget, the line item was $15 million for a study of Lake Okeechobee. Subsequently, that language was stripped out, and it was just going to be a comprehensive water quality study focusing on rivers and sources of impairment, that sort of thing. So the question is, that $25 million, is that going to be used to study Lake Okeechobee? If we're talking about impaired rivers like the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee, well, certainly Lake Okeechobee could be the source of some of that impairment, that pollution. And again, it's fine to study these problems, but what's the upshot? What exactly is going to come out of this? What exactly do we think the deliverable is going to be, or what's it going to lead to? Is this going to lead to some new suggestions, for example, on how to manage water in Lake Okeechobee? And if that's the case, who is that going to benefit? I don't have to tell you, Eve, all this sounds rather dubious, and we're going to be keeping a real close eye on this.
Yeah, these are massive amounts of money. I mean, $2 million is a large amount, but $25 million, there's good work being done at Florida Gulf Coast University for sure, but this is a windfall, and somebody really wanted these budget allocations. So let's zoom in on the 2 million first of all. That 2 million was attached to $150 million that the South Florida Water Management District needs for operating funds, a shortfall in operating funds. So the governor could not veto that $2 million for the Lake O study without vetoing the $150 million, which he wouldn't do, right? So somebody through this legislative maneuver made this study kind of veto proof. We also know that an early local funding request filed by Senator Broder, Jason Broder, asked for $5 million for the Lake O study. And it specifically said that it was to create a suite of potential water level and lake management strategies to be implemented and explored. Right. So why are we so concerned about water levels in Lake Okeechobee? It's because of what's happening right now. Yes, we do know that Lake Okeechobee suffers when the lake is high as it is. However, the solution that we are living with, and I say solution very facetiously, is lowering the lake by blasting the St. Lucie River to the east, the Caloosahatchee River to the west, and also the Lake Worth Lagoon. That's extremely detrimental to the northern estuaries. And we know there's another way. sending water south, treating it south of the lake. However, we're not hearing that from some quote unquote lake ecology advocates. So we're just going to watch this really closely. My sources at the Water Management District, which is negotiating a contract with Florida Gulf Coast, tell me that, this is going to be pilot projects and vegetation management. It's not going to be about lake levels. We're certainly going to hold them to it, because one last thing I'll say about lake levels is we just spent 4 years working with the Army Corps of Engineers, the whole environmental community, to get a new lake management plan. And that's what addresses lake levels. So let's not undermine it with a study that has some perhaps dubious intent.
Right.
The 25 million, I mean, we just got to watch that. There's a deadline on the $2 million study of January 2025. So it's going to be really quick. It's probably going to be a literature review, probably pretty superficial, like that IFAS fertilizer study was.
Mm-hmm.
The 25 million doesn't have that kind of deadline. So we've got to watch.
Right. Exactly.
All right. This is why Gil and I spent so much time on this over the last 24 hours.
It's tough to untangle, and it's changed, and the language has changed from as Eve said, Broder's initial request for the $5 million specifically articulated that water levels were going to be a part of this. And yet the final language doesn't say anything about water levels. Well, what is it? You know what I mean? And that's why, for example, we need to see the contract that the Water Management District actually signs with FGCU to see what all is, going to be in there, what all they're going to be taking a look at. But again, the whole idea, if you're going to study water levels in Lake Okeechobee, you're almost guaranteed they're going to come to the conclusion that high water levels are bad for the lake. Well, that's true. It's true. But what do we do about that is the question. And that's why I say, what's the goal? What is it exactly we think is going to be the upshot of this? Everybody can talk about how high lake levels are bad. So how do you get rid of the water? That's always been the sticking point, and so maybe these studies are going to come up with quote unquote new approaches. I suspect they'll probably be old approaches, maybe involving higher discharges to the estuaries. So, again, that's why we're being on the lookout with this.
Yeah. And one other thing to watch for on this front is we've seen quote unquote innovative technologies being deployed to address blue-green algae blooms across the state. And some of them, we're a little concerned about the long-term effects because not all algae is bad. We may see some pilot projects emerge from these studies that do something similar with technology in the lake. There's potentially a lot of money to be made off of these environmental crises. And these innovative technologies usually address the symptoms, not the disease. We need to address the disease by reining in and regulating polluters and pollution.
Right.
Okay, let me just jump in here, Gil, and say for folks watching, they can pop their questions in the chat. We're getting close to the point where we're going to take some Q&A. So add that there.
All right. So, again, for those of us with PTSD, this is the last thing we want to think about. But the 2025 legislative session convenes Tuesday, March 4th, will end Friday, May 2nd. You will see that Ben Albritton is the Senate president. Daniel Perez is the House Speaker. Albritton, he's a farmer. He's a citrus farmer, fifth generation from Hardy County. His District 27. He's a Republican. His District 27 includes Hardy, DeSoto, Charlotte, parts of Lee and Polk counties. He has sponsored several what I will call anti-environmental bills in recent years, most notably Senate Bill 1000 back in 2022, which allows citrus farmers to use rate tailoring, quote unquote, rate tailoring to determine how much fertilizer they're going to use. Basically, it's license for them to use more fertilizer to maximize yields. And he also sponsored the notorious Senate Bill 2508, that bill that generated so much heat in 2022, which would have prioritized farmers getting water, even when drought conditions were approaching, over sending it south to the Everglades and other areas that needs it. So that would have solidified Big Sugar's hold on water management of Lake Okeechobee. He was the guy that sponsored that bill. He only co-introduced one bill in 2024, which had to do with people with disabilities. 2023, he only co-introduced 4 bills, none of which had to do with environmental issues, but he's an ag guy. And to the extent agricultural runoff is a major problem for our waterways, it's going to be a tough sell with Ben Albritton at the head of the Senate. Daniel Perez is going to be the House Speaker next session, District 116. He's a Miami Republican, son of Cuban immigrants. He's indicated he's going to be less dependent on Governor DeSantis' agenda, wants the House to have his own agenda. He only sponsored or co-sponsored 3 bills this past session. Really has not. He was on the Rules and Appropriations Committees this session, did really not get involved in environmental issues, did not sponsor any bills. that would really have much of an environmental impact. So from that perspective, he's a bit of a blank slate. I guess we'll see.
Interesting. On the Albritton front and agriculture in general, yes, we know that, for example, in Lake Okeechobee, about 80% of the nutrient pollution inflows come from agriculture, mainly north of the lake. But that's not to say we're against agriculture. In fact, Friends of the Everglades in Miami-Dade County is fighting to protect working agriculture. So we just want agriculture to be responsible, deal with its own pollution, not force taxpayers to pay the cleanup bill.
Exactly. Okay. And then lastly, our last slide here on our website, you can find at everglades.org our full rundown of the session, which includes all of the updates on the various bills that we tracked this year, our final report, which notes which bills made it and which bills didn't, a whole bunch of other information you might find pertinent if you find this topic interesting.
Yeah, check it out. We'll have our post-session report, as Gil said, and we continue to add features to this section of our site every year. Again, thanks to the Tierney and Wetzel Foundation for the grant funding. I think it's really useful to just track these bills as they're flying. As you just heard, we focus on a pretty narrow subset of legislation and try to make it understandable. It's just not something that busy people in their everyday lives can do. And we're happy to offer that service. It's important to us at Friends of the Everglades. All right, so I think we have time for some Q&A now. We can queue up some questions. All right, Tom Bale says, being here at FGCU, we heard that the $25 million from the sprinkle list was a surprise because the figure everyone was discussing was $10 million. You guys know how that morphed at the last minute. So this is one of the things Gil and I were looking at yesterday. Thanks for the question, Tom. Here is what we gleaned. The sprinkle list that came from the Senate President's office on March 4th included $15 million. So that was additive to the $10 million that was already identified for this study. Again, what we're unclear about is whether that study is going to touch on Lake Okeechobee, because we know there's the separate $2 million study that the South Florida Water Management District is negotiating with FGCU. And again, I don't know what your role is, Tom, at FGCU. We appreciate our friends there. We have allies who have spent many years at FGCU. We think great work is being done at that university. This isn't to cast any doubt on the integrity of research coming out of FGCU, but it is a lot of money. And when the legislature asks for studies, there tends to be an ulterior motive.
Yeah, for sure.
All
Tom
right.
actually is a journalist. I know who Tom is. How you doing, Tom? Good to see you.
Thanks for tuning in, Tom. I guess he will not be conducting the water study then. We can take the next question. All right, Swell Connections. You mentioned at the beginning the possibility of discharges into summer. Can you elaborate on this possibility? Yes, I'll jump in, and then Gil, feel free to piggyback. We're in the middle of the latest 14-day round of discharges being conducted by the Army Corps of Engineers. This round will end on March 29th. After that, we have some reason to hope that there might be a pause on the releases as oyster spawning season occurs in the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee estuaries. That's certainly what we'll be fighting for. We'll be fighting for discharges to stop permanently. However, it is completely a matter of lake levels and rainfall. The lake is at 15.6 or so as we sit today. And we know that the Army Corps of Engineers gets nervous when we hit June 1st, the start of hurricane season, and the lake is at higher levels due to the integrity of the Herbert Hoover Dike. So one more thing to note on that front is we've had a wet winter due to El Nino, but we're going to be transitioning to a La Nina, which can bring drier weather, but also more storm activity. So I think there's good reason to suspect that the path of storms is going to matter more this year. Storm that sits over Lake O or over the Kissimmee River Valley and flows into Lake O could really make discharges more likely.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, the lake stands today at 15.59 feet. It's actually been dropping pretty fast, I guess, in part because of the discharges. 0.8 of a foot lower than it was when the discharges started on February 17th. Now, we're looking at a good bit of rain this weekend, maybe a couple inches. So if it continues to drop at the rate it's been dropping, and knock wood, we may get some relief. If it doesn't, if we get some more rain in here, it's going to provide less wiggle room, I guess, for the Corps to rethink its strategy. So, it's just we're advocating again, as always, for an end to the discharges. And it'd be great to get a break, but we need more than a break. The break needs to be permanent. So.
Yeah. The St. Lucie River never needs any water from Lake Okeechobee. We want those discharges to stop permanently. The Caloosahatchee sometimes needs dry season flows for salinity reasons, so we're advocating for an end to harmful discharges to the Caloosahatchee. Anything that's harmful is not acceptable. And let's just add, we talked about the Army Corps, but the South Florida Water Management District controls these southern gates from the lake into the Everglades agricultural area and the stormwater treatment areas. Right now, there's about 60,000 acres of man-made marshes south of the lake, the stormwater treatment areas. Roughly 90% of the capacity in those marshes is given to sugarcane runoff, not lake water. Roughly 10% in a typical year is from lake water. So we're pushing the Water Management District to really look at operations of those taxpayer-funded SDAs. We paid to build those, and we pay a large chunk of money, about $11 million a year, to operate them. Let us get some relief out of those man-made marshes. And if there's not enough capacity to treat both sugar water and lake water, well, then let's create more STAs. Mm-hmm. All right, we'll take the next question. Lauren Janitis. Hey, Lauren, thanks for tuning in. She asks why the Everglades Protection Area bill died in the House. What is the pushback or concern? I know just a little, and maybe Gil, you can add more. Sure. There was a pushback in terms of the geographic scope that caused Broward County to originally be removed, or to be removed from the original version of the bill. Right. So the pushback is coming from the development industry that doesn't want to face additional hurdles of review. I think there's good reason to believe that's why we didn't see it advance farther on just the Miami-Dade portion that remained.
Right. We had heard there were 7 development proposals in that area at one point in time. So obviously, any new restrictions that would have prohibited those development proposals from going forward or forced them to change was going to be opposed. House Bill 723, which was the House bill that didn't make it, it passed its first committee stop, Agricultural Conservation and Resiliency, in late January 29th. But the second committee stop was the Ag and Natural Resources Appropriation Subcommittee. It never got a hearing. So it had 3 committee stops it had to clear, got past its first, didn't even get a hearing in the second one, which indicates, that the committee or the representatives on it, people running the show, weren't real interested in agendaing it. And again, disappointing because the Senate bill went all the way. Senate bill passed the full Senate with a lot of sort of bipartisan praise. It was a filed by a Republican, Senator Alexis Colette. The House bill was filed by a Republican as well, House Representative Demi Posada Cabrera. So you'd think it'd get a little more traction. It just didn't. So
yeah, and I think there's another part to Lauren's question coming. I'll add while we're waiting for that. Responsible developers should want to have this rigorous review process, right? I understand that there's a lot of short-term thinking in the development industry, but we definitely want to have natural resources protected. That's part of what makes it so appealing to live in Florida.
Well, and beyond that, this is how much, as noted, how many billions of dollars have we already spent on Everglades protection? We need to protect that investment.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
This is the second part. Yes.
Yeah. I guess this is the second part. So Lauren also asks, how can the community take action to ensure the Everglades Protection Area bill passes next year? Thank you so much for thinking ahead, contacting the bill sponsors, voicing your support. And if you live in a district other than the bill sponsors district, call your local state house member or senator and tell them you like this bill. They get a lot of calls from folks complaining because so much bad legislation does emerge. I think they would like to have a call from someone supporting good legislation. So we'll try to make that easier. It's a great question, and we'll try to make that easier next time around. All right, we can take the next question. We have time for just a few more here before we wrap up. All right. Okay, Eve, can you provide a quick farm bill update? Any talk of transparency for agriculture's phosphorus use? Does the task force know how much phosphorus is being applied by the industry annually? All right, so a couple different things to unpack here. Let's talk about the federal farm bill first. The U.S. Farm Bill is negotiated every 5 years by Congress. It was supposed to be reauthorized last year in 2023. Instead, it was extended because budget negotiations, threats of government shutdown, there was a lot of chaos in Congress last year. So now we're looking at a farm bill that will expire later this year in fall of 2024. The farm bill includes a sugar program that really greatly increases the profits of the sugar industry, both sugar cane and sugar beet. It does that by setting a floor on prices and also limiting production. If you wanted to open a sugar farm, a cane farm, you would have a hard time doing that because there's limits on production. And as a result, consumers in the US pay about double the world market price of sugar. And that enriches the profits of the industry in Florida that is really complicit in a lot of our environmental problems. So if you want to learn more about this and how you can help be part of the solution in the Farm Bill, go to everglades.org and sign our Sugar Reform Now petition, because that is a great positive step we can take. Gil, do you want to take a swipe at the second part of her question, her or his question?
I mean, that I know of, there is no source saying how much phosphorus is being applied by the industry annually. But, we know phosphorus is kind of a huge factor in our impaired waterways. In Florida, best management practices attempt to, limit it, but not for the sake of water quality, as noted. Farmers will tell you that fertilizer is expensive, so they don't want it to go to waste. They don't want it to wash off their fields, obviously. But in terms of an overall amount, I couldn't even cite a source for that. I'm not even sure.
Yeah, and I think the questioner is talking about the blue-green algae task force. We do continue to tune into those task force meetings. Great members of the task force, scientists from universities across the state, including FGCU, actually. And we continue to push for implementation of their solutions identified in the report they drafted back in 2019, the first year they were created.
And they got funded in the budget to the tune of $50 million, I believe. So, they'll be around. They're going to continue to meet and talk, and we just hope it amounts to more than that.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, we have time for another question, maybe two. Where can I find a source to cite that 90% sugar figure?
I can give you one. Hang on.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, he's talking about capacity in the stormwater treatment areas. Yeah.
If I can, let me see. So stop sharing my screen here and share this screen.
These figures are actually presented every month at the South Florida Water Management District Governing Board meetings. There's a really handy chart you can look at that shows total inflows into the STAs in a water year, and it's in the agenda packets for every
Are you seeing
meeting.
This is that graphic if you're seeing it.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So this is from the South Florida Water Management District most recent environmental report. This was last Thursday. If you take a look at this graph, you see the blue is runoff. These are based on water years, like a regular year, but just wetter, right? But the blue is runoff to the STAs or stormwater treatment areas. That is agricultural runoff to the STAs. The yellow is the lake to the stormwater treatment areas, lake water going to these STAs. So you can see, look at these last 2 years in particular. The amount of lake water going to the STAs, water storage and treatment, is minuscule compared to the amount that's going from the runoff from the EAA, the Everglades agricultural area, dominated by big sugar. In previous years, you had significantly more water from the lake that was able to go, but at no point have we seen a majority of, or even half, of water from the lake going to the STAs being given priority over runoff from the farm fields. Agricultural runoff, big sugar's runoff, is given priority as sort of that's how the system works. They get the capacity in these STAs, and it's only when they don't need some of that capacity that water from the lake can go into it. So the district produces these reports every month, and again, you can sort of drill down and get granular and just see exactly how much room is there at the inn, who's taking up all the space, and when you see the blue, it ain't the lake. So
yeah. Thanks, Gil. Glad you
Yep.
had that at your fingertips. We'll take one more question. Maxwell Muller on Instagram asks, who is pushing the long-term fertilizer test? Big Sugar or what? Maybe he means study. What do you think? Who's pushing that, Gil?
Well, again, I think they're required to update the BMPs every so often, and they haven't done so. So, it's not, that respect isn't some nefarious plot. But again, the best management practices are formulated not with water quality in mind, but with agricultural yield in mind. So they're formulated on the basis that you want to get as much yield. Want to get the best bang for your buck, right? You want to get as much yield as you can with the fewest inputs, the least fertilizer uses, because as noted, fertilizer is expensive. So, but instead of coming from a perspective of, look, Florida's water is in trouble, and we know that runoff is a big reason for that, and we've got to do something to limit that runoff in a way that can hopefully, sustain or boost that, yield. That's not how we approach it. And we approach it from the perspective of, we're looking to boost yield, and, oh yeah, here's how we're going to do it. And we're going to use this much fertilizer. And well, if that means that some of that fertilizer runs off into the water, that's not part of our purview, sort of thing. So
yeah. Thanks, Gil. Great questions. Appreciate everyone tuning in today. We are at the 1 hour mark, and we try not to keep you longer than that at Friends of the Everglades. We will be hosting other live stream events between now and the start of next session on different topics, including the Florida Right to Clean Water Amendment that's coming up. So please stay tuned. Go to everglades.org, sign up for our emails. You can get alerts to register for these free webinars. And if you're so inclined, make a donation. It supports this kind of work that we're doing. Thank you, everybody. Gil, get some rest, recover from your PTSD fully, because the next session will be here before we know it.
Yes,
everyone, have a great day. Thanks.